In the autumn of 1992, there was a gentleman named Michael Plant who was a popular American yachtsman. And he decided that he was going to sail from the United States to France in the northern Atlantic. And he tricked out a boat he called the Coyote. It was a boat that had all the amenities of home. It had the most up-to-date modern design. It was unsinkable, they said. Most sailboats are. They're tricked out just so to make sure that there's more weight underneath the waterline than there is on top of the waterline. And it had an 8,000-pound weight that was bolted to its keel to keep the boat upright. He had this incredible 406 megahertz emergency position indicating radio beacon that was supposed to warn people if and when he got lost. They would be able to fix on his location and quickly get to him. But 11 days into this new adventure, all radio contact was lost. Now, sailboats, they say, aren't supposed to be able to capsize. They're like floating corks. So they dispatched, after 11 days of not hearing anything from Michael Plant, they dispatched helicopters. They notified airlines to keep watch for him as they flew their patterns over the northern Atlantic. They cautioned ships as they passed through those waters to look for him. And finally, they found the Coyote. It was upside down, floating in the water. And there was no trace of Michael Plant. They quickly discovered what had caused the problem. Somehow, some way, that 8,000-pound weight that had been bolted to the keel of the sailboat had come loose. And when there's not more weight underneath the waterline than on top of it, the sailboat has a penchant to tip over. And so in the midst of a storm, because it wasn't properly weighted, the sailboat tipped over. Jesus talked about that. He said these words. In the meantime, when so many thousands of the people had gathered together that they were trampling on one another, he began to say to the disciples first, "Beware of the leaven of the Pharisees. Nothing is covered up that will not be revealed, or hidden that will not be known." I've always thought it amusing that we give actors and actresses who we award Oscars on a special day of the year. I've always thought it interesting that we give these people an amazing gift of being able to tell us and give us advice. Because you see, actors and actresses are simply really, really good hypocrites. Actors, actresses. And Jesus said that we're supposed to beware of the leaven of the Pharisees, which is hypocrisy. When there's more on top than there is underneath. When they get turned upside down and they decide what is bad is good and what is good is bad. They look good on the top, but underneath there's nothing there. And Jesus said, you better be careful about the leaven of the Pharisees. Now, I say that to you because we're right in the middle of the trial of Jesus. He is being tried by Pharisees. And he's on his way from one trial to another. He's been tried by the Jews, by the Pharisees, and the Sadducees, and they had declared him guilty. And now they just need a rubber stamp from Pilate to be able to kill him. They bribed the disciple. They've arrested Jesus secretly. They've convened a trial at night. They've secured witnesses to lie. And there are several accounts that have been written that went public after the trial. And so we know what happened because what was spoken in secret has been made open to everyone. And we've discovered that what was on top was just show. There wasn't anything underneath. So this morning, I need you to really try hard to stay awake. Now, I know for some of you that's a stretch. I've taught Sunday school this morning, and we had several people nodding off in Sunday school. And it broke my heart. But I know some of you don't get a lot of rest. I remember one time when I was preaching at a rural church up in Missouri. One of the farmers there had an ulcer, and he brought some warm milk to church to drink during the worship service. That was back when we didn't know how to treat ulcers all that well, and he'd go to sleep during the sermon. And he told me afterwards, he said, I get some of the best sleep in church, some of the best sleep. And I know that some of you just fight really hard to stay awake, and I could call you out by name, but I won't do that. But I just really need you to try real hard to stay awake, because we're going to go through something that's really, really, really important. And I want to talk about, first of all, that when we come to the person of Jesus, there is predisposed bias. People are biased when you talk about Jesus. A matter of fact, Jesus told his disciples, if the world hated me, it will hate you too. Bank on it. And so there's a predisposed bias that we deal with when we come to the trial of Jesus. People weren't going to give him his day in court. And if we're honest about it, there are a lot of people today who are predisposed not to believe in Jesus. All you have to do is watch sitcoms on the television or movies, and you realize whenever there's a Christian person portrayed, it's usually not in a positive light. Usually they're narrow-minded bigots, or they're all kinds of other people, and when they're put in the movies or on the TV shows or they're written about in books, it's not a flattering portrayal. And so we need to understand there's a lot of predisposed bias in our world today. And so the books of Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John were written by people who had witnessed Jesus and wrote down what they saw, and they wrote down from his perspective, and they wrote to a group of people who were predisposed to be biased against Jesus. And you need to understand that. And so I want to talk about, first of all, as the trial finished in the Jewish sector and moved to the Roman sector, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, all of them talk about it. And I'm just going to read what they say. I'm not going to put words in their mouths. I'm not going to try to bias you one way or another. I'm just going to read what the witnesses say. Matthew was written from 75 to 80 A.D., just about 40 years after this took place. This is what Matthew says. He was a tax collector and took money from Jewish people before he met Jesus and was converted. This is what he said. But Jesus remained silent. And the high priest said to him, I adjure you by the living God, tell us if you are the Christ, the Son of God. Jesus said to him, you have said so. But I tell you from now on, you will see the Son of Man seated at the right hand of power and coming on the clouds of heaven. Then the high priest tore his robes and said, he has uttered blasphemy. What further witnesses do we need? You have now heard his blasphemy. What is your judgment? They answered, he deserves death. Then they spit in his face and struck him. And some slapped him, saying, prophesy to us, you Christ, who is it that struck you? Matthew wrote those words 40 years after the event happened. Mark wrote his words in 65 AD, which is 30 years after it happened. But he remained silent and made no answer. Again, the high priest asked him, "Are you the Christ, the Son of the Blessed?" And Jesus said, "I am, and you will see the Son of Man seated at the right hand of power and coming with the clouds of heaven." And the high priest tore his garments and said, "What further witnesses do we need? You have heard this blasphemy. What is your decision?" And some began to spit on him and to cover his face and to strike him, saying, "Prophesy." And the guards received him with blows. Now, I don't know if you've been to a court of law and seen the bailiff and the judge and the jurors spit, cover face of the person that was condemned, strike him with blows, and received him with blows. I don't know if you've ever seen that in a trial. But Mark records that this happened at the trial of Jesus. Luke records in 80 to 85 AD, this is 40 years after it happened, these words: "If you are the Christ, tell us." But he said to them, "If I tell you, you will not believe. And if I ask you, you will not answer. But from now on, the Son of Man shall be seated at the right hand of the power of God." So they all said, "Are you the Son of God then?" And he said to them, "You say that I am." Then they said, "What further testimony do we need? We have heard it ourselves from his own lips." 3 testimonies from 3 witnesses written after the event happened, close to the time this took place, and all, I think you will agree with each other. Now, John was written a little later. It was written at around 100 AD. John waded in after a few years had taken place and the church had grown. John felt compelled to write his gospel. And this is what he said. "Then they led Jesus from the house of Caiaphas to the governor's headquarters. It was early morning." Now, this is interesting to me because for some reason, John wants us to know 20 years after Matthew, Mark, Luke were written, he wants us to know it was early morning. Now, why does he want us to know that? Because they wanted to get this done. They were in a hurry. They wanted to be over with because it was a holiday weekend. And they had family coming in from all over. And they were trying to get ready for the Passover. They were trying to get ready for the food. They were trying to get ready for a good time. And they needed this over. They needed it done. They were in a hurry. So John says it was early in the morning. Now, I don't know if you've been around religious people who think the wrong things are more important than the right things. But these people thought it was more important to get Jesus crucified so they could get on with their lives. They could get on with having a good time. And they needed to get this over with. So they brought him early in the morning to get it taken care of, to mark it off the list, to get it finished. And then John goes on to say this, and I can't even believe he said this. They themselves did not enter the governor's headquarters so that they would not be defiled but could eat the Passover. So they brought Jesus from the trial they had in Caiaphas' house. They beat him, they spat on him, they put a piece of cloth over his head and they beat him from this way and that and said, "Okay, tell us who did it. If you're a prophet, tell us which one did that." And after they made fun of him, they took the piece of cloth off of his head. They took him to Pilate's headquarters because they needed this done. They needed him killed, and they needed it done so they could get home and get to cooking what they needed to get finished. So they get over there, and because it's a Gentile's house, because it's the Roman curator's house, because it's the praetorium, they can't enter because it would defile them. And so they stayed out in the courtyard. So that way, they could eat the Passover. Now, if I'm Jesus, just a few days before, Jesus had said this: "You blind guides, you strain at a gnat and you swallow a camel." You guys think that it's more important for you to stand out here in the courtyard because you don't want to go into where Pilate lives because you would be defiled, so you're going to stand out here so that he will have me killed. And you're straining at a gnat and you're swallowing a camel. And if it weren't so sad, it would be hilariously funny. Paul talks about it earlier when he wrote his book to the Corinthians in 55 AD, which was only 20 years after this happened. And this is what Paul says. He's describing these people. This is what Paul says. "But their minds were hardened. For to this day, when they read the Old Covenant, that same veil remains unlifted, because only through Christ is it taken away. Yes, to this day, whenever Moses is read, a veil lies over their hearts. But when one turns to the Lord, the veil is removed." What Paul says as he tries to share the gospel with people who are of the Jewish persuasion, when you try to tell them about Jesus, it's like there's a veil over their eyes whenever you mention his name. And he says that the only way that veil is lifted is when you pray to God and say, "God, I want to know. Please help me." Have you ever prayed that prayer? God, if there's anything keeping me from seeing Jesus, if there's anything making me prejudiced and biased against him, please, God, lift that from my heart. Lift that from my mind. Help me to see who Jesus really is. And then there's this unexpected response. So Pilate went outside to them. So these people are out in the courtyard. They won't go inside because they'll be defiled and won't get to celebrate the holiday with their family. So they make Pilate go out to engage them. And Pilate shocks them. Now, I want to introduce you to Pilate, just so you can understand why they're shocked. Pilate was a guy who went to Rome and married the daughter of Augustus, who was married to a wife that he hated. The wife that Augustus was married to was an absolutely despicable woman. And everybody who lived in Rome knew it. And Augustus couldn't stand his own wife. Well, she had a daughter, and Pilate married her. So Pilate got an appointment from Augustus to go back to Jerusalem to be declared the governor of the state of Judea. And he had a palace that he lived in. And his wife had told him when the trial was going on with Jesus that she had had a dream. And she told him, "Be careful about this Jesus. I've had a dream and you don't want to get involved." So Pilate had been told that by his wife. He also, just a few days before, when he came into Jerusalem, he had his soldiers ride into the city of Jerusalem with these standards that had big pictures, medallions of Caesar on the top of them. He rode into Jerusalem at night knowing the Jews wouldn't like that. And sure enough, the Jews went to Caesarea where he set up camp, and they had a riot in Caesarea because they wanted those standards removed. And finally, Pilate gathered them in a stadium, And he surrounded them with his Roman soldiers and told them if they didn't comply, he would kill them all. At which time the Jews hit the ground. They took back their robes from their necks and bared their necks and dared him to kill them. And Pilate backed down. So the Jews had already taken him on. The Jews had already flexed their political muscles, and Pilate had backed down. Then he made these shields to put in Herod's palace. And these shields had likenesses of Tiberius, the emperor, emblazoned on these shields. And the Jewish leaders wrote a note to Caesar telling him to tell Pilate to take the shields out of Herod's palace. And once again, Pilate relented. 2 times the Jews had taken him on, and 2 times he'd given in. So when the Jews are walking over to his palace with Jesus, asking for him to rubber stamp what they'd all agreed, that Jesus was to be killed, they thought it was a slam dunk. So Pilate goes outside, and they're expecting him just to rubber stamp what they said. And the first words out of his mouth were, "What accusation do you bring against this man?" He reopens the case. He reopens it. And they are shocked. They can't believe that Pilate would even dare question them about what they had decided to do. So they answered him, "If this man weren't doing evil, we would not have delivered him over to you." Look, if we say he's a bad dude, he's a bad dude. And we're telling you, this guy is a criminal. And he does evil. And he needs to be killed. And we want you to do what we say. Now, I don't know if you've ever noticed this in your life or not, but sometimes when you're about to make a bad decision, God tries to get you to stop. And sometimes he uses people you would never expect. Sometimes he'll use somebody that's not even a believer, somebody that's not even a Christian, somebody that might even not believe in God. And he'll use that person to try to get your attention to slow down and reconsider what you're about to do. And here God's using Pontius Pilate, who is not a man of integrity, who has no values, who's a ladder climber, and just trying to get where he wants to get. And God's using him to get these Jewish people who have already done what they've decided to do, to get them to stop and wait and rethink this, to make sure it's what they really want to do. And sometimes God does that. I remember, and I think I've told you this before, I remember I got a phone call one time from a person that lived in another city, and I think their son had been arrested for trying to rob a convenience store. Could you please go down and see him? I said, well, sure, I'll be glad to do that. So I got in my car, drove down to Lou Sterrett, and went through all the protocol, and went to visit him, sat down, got the phone, he got the phone, and he didn't know me, I didn't know him, so I'm just trying to get acquainted. I said, well, how did this happen? I mean, what was going on? He said, well, I don't know. He said, we were a friend of mine and myself. We were in the car, and he said, why don't we go rob this store, and why don't we go do this? And I said, well, and then I started to pray. And I said, God, if you don't want me to go rob this store, please have something happen that'll, please. And nothing happened. Nothing took place. And so we go in the store, and we get arrested, and I'm down here in jail, and that's how I got here. Well, I wanted to say a lot of things. But you know, sometimes God uses people like policemen and things like that to try to get us to slow down and rethink what we're doing. And that's what's going on here. These Pharisees, these Sadducees, they've made up their minds. They've been politically biased. They decided that Jesus was a bad dude and did a bunch of bad things, and he needs to be crucified. He needs to be killed. And what blows my mind is these people are experts on God. And they're standing before Pontius Pilate saying, God needs to die. Explain that to me. The Son of God needs to die. And Jesus doesn't say anything. They're the experts. They know, but they don't know. They think they're smart, but they're not smart. They think they're intellectually above everybody else, but they're not. And they're doing the very thing they say their vocation is in this for them to do. They're experts on God, and they want to kill his son. Explain that. And they basically go to Pilate, and they say this: if this man weren't doing evil, we wouldn't have delivered him over to you. Basically, they're saying, hey, trust us. Trust us. We know what we're doing. We've had a trial. It's been a fair trial. We heard the witnesses. We did all the stuff. Trust us. This is the right thing. And so Pilate says, well, take him yourselves and judge him by your own law. Take him yourselves and judge him by your own law. Now, Jesus said, I didn't come to do away with the law. I came to fulfill it. So if you're going to judge Jesus by the law, what are you going to find wrong? Put Jesus up against the law. How did he violate it? How did he go against it? What did he do? Oh, he healed a guy on the Sabbath. Oh, you're not supposed to heal on the Sabbath. No, you're not. He didn't wash his hands. When he went to the Pharisee's house, he didn't wash his hands before dinner. And he broke the law. He healed a guy that was blind on the Sabbath day. You're not supposed to do that. You're not supposed to work on the Sabbath. He gave a guy the ability to see on the Sabbath day. That's wrong. He needs to die for it. We got this figured out. The only problem is, the Jews said to him, it's not lawful for us to put anyone to death. So we get the fulfilled expectations. You see, what people don't realize is the Jews had tried to kill Jesus before. I'm just going to go through these scriptures real fast because I want you to see that they had tried to kill Jesus before this. And I want you to make sure that it isn't just me saying so, it's what the witnesses said. Luke chapter 4, verse 28 to 29. So they could throw him down the cliff. He came to his own town of Nazareth. They got so upset at Jesus, they wanted to throw him off a cliff and kill him. John 8:58. Jesus said to them, before Abraham was, I am. So they picked up stones to throw at him, but Jesus hid himself and went out of the temple. John 10:31. The Jews picked up stones again to stone him. John 10:39. Again they sought to arrest him, but he escaped from their hands. John 11:8. The disciples said to him, Rabbi, the Jews were just now seeking to stone you, and you are going there again? You see, Jesus had been sought by the Jews to be stoned over and over because they want him dead. But stoning means you are pushed down. Crucifixion means you are raised up. And it says in John, Jesus said this. It says this was to fulfill the word that Jesus had spoken to show by what kind of death he was going to die. This is so important. You see, all these people think they are in control. The Jews think they're in control. Jesus is bound. He cannot move his hands. He's brought before Pilate. The Jews think they control Pilate. Pilate wants to make sure the Jews know he controls them. And Jesus is standing there before all of them, and the truth is, he's the one in control. Because Jesus had predicted weeks earlier that the way he was going to die wasn't by stoning when he was pushed down, but by crucifixion where he would be raised up. And that was a big deal to Jesus, that he would be raised up in his death. Listen to what it says in John 3. As Moses lifted up the serpent in the wilderness, so must the Son of Man be lifted up, that whoever believes in him may have eternal life. And then you know the next verse. For God so loved the world that he gave his only begotten Son. The verse preceding that was Jesus predicting that he would be lifted up. In John 8:28, so Jesus said to them, when you have lifted up the Son of Man, then you will know that I am he, and that I do nothing on my own authority, but speak just as the Father taught me. And I, when I am lifted up, in John 12:32, will draw all people to myself. He said this to show by what kind of death he was going to die. Jesus predicted it before he was even killed. He stands before them with his arms bound, having spittle in his beard, having blood on his face, in total control. So verse 33. So Pilate entered his headquarters again and called Jesus. Can you see this? So it's freezing outside because you remember that they built a fire. Peter was warming his hands by the fire when he denied Jesus. So it's freezing cold. So Jesus is standing out in the courtyard with all these Pharisees and Sadducees who want him dead, who want Pilate to rubber stamp his decree for murder. And Pilate goes back inside. And when he goes back inside, he calls Jesus to come in alone. So Jesus walks across the courtyard, up the stairs, into Pilate's house. And when he gets inside, Pilate says these words to Jesus. They're just by themselves. And Pilate says these words. Are you the King of the Jews? Now you get the feeling that when Pilate says those words, he's basically saying something like this. Really? You want to be king of that? Really? You think that's an honor? You think that's a feather in your cap? Do you think that's something to brag about, that you want to be king of that? The ship was upside down. There was no weight below the water. Communication with God had been cut off. The radio wasn't working. But they didn't have a clue. They were upset at Jesus because he dared heal on the Sabbath. Pilate says that he realized that the Jews were envious of Jesus. And that's why they wanted him dead. He had cleansed the temple and threatened their money-making schemes. He told a man that was lame that his sins were forgiven and to take up his bed and walk. And these men, these leaders, these experts in God said, enough is enough. He's got to die. But Jesus basically said, oh, I'll die all right. But I'll die my way. I'll die lifted up, not pushed down. Because if the Son of Man is lifted up, he will draw all men to himself. Up until 1961, there was no archaeological evidence that Pilate even existed. There's no proof. And a lot of people said, this is just a made-up story, just a myth. Didn't really happen. It's good print, but not much to it. And then all of a sudden, they were excavating for a theater in the city of Caesarea. And as they were excavating, they hit the stone. And they realized that the stone was something special, and so they began to carefully dig around it, and they unearthed the stone. And there was a partial inscription on the stone that bore the name of Pontius Pilate. He was a real person who asked the question, are you the king of the Jews? Now, people, we're going through the trials of Jesus. And I've never done this before, and it's been so good for me just to do this. But we all are on trial here. Because the Bible tells us in Psalms that the stone the builders rejected has become the cornerstone. And it is marvelous in our eyes. This is the day the Lord has made. We will rejoice and be glad in it. This stone that was bound, that kept silent, that was given the verdict that he must die, this stone has become the cornerstone of what God is doing in the entire earth. And we are a part of the building that God is building. That's why we're named Cornerstone Christian Church. And that's why, because of all of this, this is the day that the Lord has made, and we will rejoice and be glad in it because of what Jesus Christ, the Son of God, has done for us. It's amazing. Let's pray. Our Father in heaven, we thank you for the words of Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, who carefully wrote down what happened in these moments. We realize, Lord, that all of us are put on trial, that all of us get into circumstances that reveal our thoughts, that reveal our hearts, that reveal what's important to us, that reveal what we think about all the time and what matters to us. It reveals our envy. It reveals our anger. It reveals our frustrations. And we realize, Lord, that when Jesus was put on trial for crimes he didn't commit, that it revealed his incredible heart, the virtue and the impeccable integrity, the goodness, the wholeness, the health, the emotional strength of who he was. And we're thankful, Lord, that he is at your right hand right now, interceding for the likes of us. We're thankful, Lord, that you love us and that it's revealed over and over again that you did not withhold anything from us, as evidenced by what we talked about this morning. So, Lord, I pray that if there's anyone here who doesn't know you, who needs to receive Jesus, who needs to have freedom and to be released from the past, Lord, I pray that today we'll get to see that happen. And we ask, Lord, that you would move in these moments as we come to them. We pray this in Jesus' name. Amen.